Hey guys, welcome back to Fiction Flux. Hope you're all doing well. Now let's get into it. Kai Chisaki was not capable of love. That was what everyone who knew him believed. His subordinates, the Yakuza elders, the heroes who had studied his file, the commission analysts who had built psychological profiles on him with the careful language of people who understood they were describing something that did not fit standard categories. Not capable of love. They were wrong. He was capable of it. He was just incapable of surviving it without it changing everything. And Kai Chisaki, the man who controlled everything in his environment down to the specific angle of a water glass on a table, did not survive things that changed everything gracefully. He survived them by dismantling them. He had been dismantling things since he was a child. The thing you needed to understand about Kai Chisaki, before you understood anything else about him, was the contamination. Not the quirk, the contamination was not the quirk. The quirk was the mechanism. The contamination was the specific quality of his relationship with the world that preceded the quirk and had been present in him before he had language for it, and would have been present even if the quirk had never manifested. The world was dirty. That was the foundational belief, not a fear exactly, not a phobia in the clinical sense, a conviction, the deep architectural certainty that the world was inherently contaminated and that the only appropriate response to contamination was control. Clean environments, managed interactions, the specific protocols he had developed over years of careful iteration to minimize his exposure to the uncontrolled elements of a world that could not be trusted to maintain its own cleanliness. He was good at control. He had built an entire organization around it. The Shie Hassaikai operated with a precision that other criminal organizations admired without fully understanding. The precision was not tactical, it was constitutional. It was the natural output of an organization run by someone for whom imprecision was not an acceptable operating condition. He ran it from behind gloves and masks and protocols. He ran it from a controlled distance. He had been running things from a controlled distance his entire life. He first became aware of her through a file. This was appropriate. Most things Kai Chisaki became aware of arrived through files first. Files were clean. Files were organized. Files gave you the shape of something before you had to encounter the something itself, which meant you could prepare the encounter properly rather than having it arrive in the uncontrolled way that direct experience tended to arrive. The file was a commission intelligence summary that one of his information sources had acquired. It was about the top performers in UA's current first-year class, standard material, the kind of thing the Hassaikai monitored as a matter of operational awareness. Most of the file was expected. Bakugo Katsuki, the combustion type, highest combat assessment, aggressive processing, known variable, expected. Todoroki Shoto, the dual type, exceptional power ceiling, family complication, known variable, expected. He had read these before in various forms. He turned to the third entry. Midoriya Izumi. The entry was longer than the others. This was the first unusual thing. He read it with the quality of attention he gave everything, total and precise, and organized around the question of what the information meant rather than just what it said. She had the highest rescue assessment in the program's recorded history. Not in her year, in the program's history. He read that twice. She had broken multiple bones in her first major assessment and had continued performing at high level despite the injury, adapting her approach in real time to compensate for the reduced capacity. She had notebooks. The file noted this specifically because the notebooks were apparently numerous enough and detailed enough that they had come up in multiple independent reports from observers who had interacted with her. She had been quirkless until 15. One for all was a transferred quirk rather than an innate one. The psychological profile noted the specific quality of someone who had built their capability through something other than natural talent. He turned the page. The psychological profile section was the part that made him read the file a second time from the beginning. The profile said, subject demonstrates unusual capacity for structural analysis of situations and individuals. Subject consistently identifies load-bearing elements of complex situations faster than peers. Subject appears to notice things that other observers miss. Subject's care for others appears genuine rather than performed, which produces atypical responses in individuals who interact with her. He read atypical responses in individuals who interact with her. He thought about that for a long time. He filed the file in the clean folder. He did not think about it again for 3 weeks. He thought about it constantly for 3 weeks. The first encounter was not planned. He did not do unplanned encounters. Unplanned encounters were the specific category of event that his protocols existed to prevent. The world in its uncontrolled state produced encounters that had not been sanitized by preparation, and preparation was the difference between a manageable interaction and a contamination event. He was in a district he did not usually frequent. He was there because of an operational meeting that had relocated at the last minute due to a police presence issue, and he had rerouted through a part of the city that was not in his standard movement patterns. She was sitting on the steps of a building, writing in a notebook. He registered her from 40 meters. The green hair, the freckles, the notebook. He kept walking. He kept walking past the building. He slowed without deciding to slow. He stopped. He stood on the pavement with the specific internal experience of someone whose protocols had just encountered an exception they had not coded for. She had not looked up. She was writing with a quality of focus that was, the word that arrived was clean. The focus was clean, not in the contamination sense, in the sense of being entirely what it was without anything else mixed in. Pure application of attention to the thing receiving the attention. He had been trying to achieve that quality in his operations for years. He stood on the pavement. She looked up. She looked at him with the green eyes and the expression of someone who noticed things. She said, "You've been standing there for 2 minutes." He said, "I was observing." She said, "I know, you have a quality of observation that's different from most people's." He said, "What quality?" She said, "Most people observe as assessment, you observe as analysis. The assessment asks, what is this? The analysis asks, what does this mean?" He said, "And you can see the difference." She said, "I notice things, it's a documented tendency." He said, "Documented how?" She said, "Notebooks, I have 24. He said, "About what?" She said, "Everything, the gap between what things are and what they claim to be. People, systems, the architecture of how things work." He said, "The architecture." She said, "Yes." He said, "You use that word specifically." She said, "It's the most accurate word for what I'm interested in, not the surface, the structure underneath that holds the surface up." He said, "Load-bearing elements." She said, "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "Your file uses that phrase, the Commission's psychological profile." He said, "You've read my file." She said, "I've read everyone's file. I have notebooks about everyone's file." He said, "What does your notebook about my file say?" She said, "Do you want to know?" He said, "Yes." She closed her current notebook. She opened a different one. She said, "It says that the contamination framework is the organizing architecture of everything, not just the quirk application, everything, the distance, the protocols, the specific quality of control that your organization operates with." She said, "And it says the framework is a response to something rather than a starting point." He said, "A response to what?" She said, "I don't have enough data yet, that's the gap in the entry." He said, "And you want to fill it?" She said, "I want accurate documentation." "Yes." He said, "For what purpose?" She said, "Understanding, I don't do things for other purposes. Understanding is the purpose." He said, "You're not trying to arrest me." She said, "I'm sitting on steps writing in a notebook. I'm not in a position to arrest anyone." He said, "That's not an answer." She said, "No, I'm not trying to arrest you." He said, "Why not?" She said, "Because right now you're standing on a pavement 2 minutes into an unplanned stop, looking at me like the stop was a contamination event you didn't expect, and I find that more interesting than any arrest scenario." He was very still. He said, "You find it interesting?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm a criminal organization leader." She said, "Yes, and you stopped walking voluntarily and you're still here." He said, "The notebook." She said, "Yes." He said, "You were writing when I stopped." She said, "Yes." He said, "The focus." She said, "Yes." He said, "You noticed I looked at the focus." She said, "I notice everything, I told you." He said, "And the focus is why I stopped." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's an accurate assessment." She said, I try to be accurate. He said, most people. She said, I know what most people try to be. He said, and you're not most people. She said, I have 24 notebooks. No, I'm not. He looked at her. She looked at him. The street was ordinary around them. He said, you're not afraid of contamination. She said, I'm not afraid of you. Is that the same thing? He said, in this context, yes. She said, I notice before I feel things. What I'm noticing is someone who stopped walking voluntarily and has been standing here for 4 minutes. The stopping and the staying suggest interest rather than threat. He said, and if the interest became a threat? She said, I have 1 for all and 24 notebooks. I'm not defenseless. He said, 1 for all at what percentage? She said, enough. He said, that's not a percentage. She said, it's enough, that's the accurate answer. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, the entry in your notebook, the one about my file. She said, yes. He said, it says the framework is a response to something. She said, yes. He said, and you want to know what? She said, I want accurate documentation. Yes. He said, that would require more interaction. She said, yes. He said, that's a significant request given what I am. She said, I know what you are. He said, and? She said, and the entry needs to be complete. He said, for accuracy. She said, yes. He said, not for any other reason. She looked at him. She said, the entry needs to be complete. That's the whole reason. He said, most people would want something else from a criminal organization leader. She said, most people are not me. He said, no. He said, they're not. He looked at the street. He looked at the steps. He said, I walk this route on Tuesdays. The operational reroute this week was atypical. She said, I write on these steps on Tuesdays. It's in my standard movement pattern. He said, so Tuesday. She said, Tuesday. He said, that's not an agreement to interaction. She said, no, it's a statement of movement patterns. He said, accurate. She said, always. He walked away. He walked 4 blocks before he processed what had just happened. He had given her his Tuesday movement pattern. He had given a hero student his Tuesday movement pattern. He stood on the pavement and felt the specific quality of something that had not been through the protocols. The protocols had not been applied. The encounter had happened before the protocols could engage. He thought about the focus was clean. He thought about the entry needs to be complete. He walked back to the Hassaikai compound. He removed his gloves with the specific careful process he always used. He sat at his desk. He did not contaminate anything. But he sat for a long time thinking about load-bearing elements and what it meant that the entry needed to be complete. Tuesday came. He told himself he was not going to the steps. He walked the route anyway. She was there. He sat on the step above her. Not beside, above, the specific positioning that allowed proximity without the full weight of proximity. She said, Tuesday. He said, Tuesday. She said, you came. He said, I walk this route on Tuesdays. She said, the operational reroute last week was atypical. He said, yes. She said, so this route is the reroute. The regular route is different. He said, yes. She said, you changed your Tuesday route. He said, movement patterns can be adjusted. She said, yes, they can. She went back to writing. He sat on the step above her. He did not touch anything. He had his gloves on. The steps were probably not clean. He sat on them anyway. After a while she said, the response question. He said, yes. She said, I've been thinking about it since the pavement encounter. He said, and? She said, I think the contamination framework responds to unpredictability. The world is unpredictable. The contamination is the way unpredictability arrives in your architecture, unannounced, uncontrolled, capable of changing things without permission. She said, the protocols are not about cleanliness specifically, they're about control of inputs. He said, most people describe it as a disorder. She said, most people describe what they don't understand as disorders. I prefer accurate description. He said, and the accurate description is. She said, someone who needs controlled inputs to function optimally and has built a system to produce controlled inputs in an environment that naturally resists control. He said, that's the most clinical description I've received. She said, I'm not being clinical, I'm being accurate. Clinical implies detachment. This is accurate with engagement. He said, what's the difference? She said, the clinical description observes from outside. The accurate description with engagement says, I understand what the framework is for, and I'm not going to pretend it's irrational just because it's extreme. He said, you think it's rational? She said, I think it's the correct response to a specific internal architecture, encountering a specific external environment. Whether it's optimal is a different question. He said, is it optimal? She said, no. She said it simply, without cruelty, without the performance of being direct, just no. He said, explain. She said, optimal would be the system that produces the best outcomes with the least cost. The current system produces high control with high cost. The cost is isolation from everything that can't be put through the protocols, which is most things. He said, isolation is not a cost, it's a feature. She said, that's what the framework says. Yes. He said, you disagree with the framework. She said, I'm documenting the framework. I'll note the disagreements separately. He said, you separate documentation from interpretation. She said, yes, the documentation is what is. The interpretation is what I think about what is. They're different notebooks. He said, how many notebooks is the interpretation? She said, currently 7, but the documentation feeds it so it grows. He said, and I'm in the documentation. She said, yes, since the pavement encounter. He said, what section? She said, load-bearing elements, that's the working title. He said, load-bearing elements. She said, the structures underneath the surface that hold everything else up. Your framework is a load-bearing element. Everything the Hassaikai is operates on top of it. He said, and if the load-bearing element is suboptimal? She said, then everything on top of it is also suboptimal. Yes. He said, you're describing my organization as architecturally flawed. She said, I'm describing the foundation of your organization's internal design as costing more than optimal. The organization itself is separately analyzed. He said, what section is the organization in? She said, institutional architecture, that's a different notebook. He said, you have a notebook about the Hassaikai. She said, I have notebooks about most significant organizational structures. Institutional architecture is notebook 20. He said, and load-bearing elements is. She said, notebook 15. He said, I'm in notebook 15. She said, the framework section, yes. He said, what section is the Tuesday entry in? She looked at him. She said, that's a different notebook. He said, which one? She said, 25. He said, you started a new notebook. She said, the Tuesday entry required its own category. He said, why? She said, because it doesn't fit the existing categories. He said, what are the existing categories? She said, analysis, documentation, interpretation, structural critique, personal record. He said, and the Tuesday entry. She said, doesn't fit any of them cleanly. He said, what would you call the category it belongs to? She said, I'm still working on the title. He said, you don't have a title. She said, not yet. He said, that's unusual. She said, yes. She said, for me, specifically, yes. He sat on the step above her. She wrote, the Tuesday was ordinary around them. He said, the gloves. She said, yes. He said, I wear them always. She said, I know. He said, the quirk is disassembly and reassembly. Contact without intent can still. She said, yes, I know how the quirk works. He said, notebook 15. She said, notebook 15. The quirk mechanics are in the technical appendix. He said, you wrote a technical appendix. She said, the notebooks are comprehensive. He said, yes. He said, they are. He looked at his gloved hands. He said, I have never sat on steps with another person without the encounter being controlled. She said, I know. He said, this was not controlled. She said, no. He said, I did it anyway. She said, yes. He said, why? She said, you're asking me why you did it. He said, I'm asking for the accurate analysis. She said, the accurate analysis says the framework encountered something it didn't have a protocol for, and the encounter happened before the protocol could be written. He said, and what didn't the framework have a protocol for? She said, the focus. He said, the writing focus. She said, yes. He said, the clean focus. She said, the focus that was completely what it was without anything else mixed in. Yes. He said, that's the load-bearing element. She said, yes. He said, what does that mean? She said, it means the framework is designed to produce that quality internally. The controlled environment is an attempt to produce internally what the writing focus produces naturally. He said, the control produces the quality. She said, the control attempts to produce it. The quality in the writing doesn't need control to exist. It exists because the engagement is genuine. He said, genuine engagement doesn't require protocols. She said, no. He said, but the framework doesn't know how to produce genuine engagement, only controlled engagement. She said, yes. He said, so the framework has been trying to produce through control what can only be produced through genuine. He stopped. He said, that's the suboptimal part. She said, yes. He said, the foundation is trying to produce something that the foundation's own design prevents it from producing. She said, yes. He said, that's. She said, a significant architectural problem, yes. He was quiet. She wrote. He sat on the step. He said, the contamination. She said, yes. He said, genuine engagement requires uncontrolled input. She said, yes. He said, an uncontrolled input is the definition of contamination in the framework. She said, yes. He said, so the framework prevents the thing it's trying to achieve. She said, yes. He said, by design. She said, by the internal logic of its own premises. Yes. He sat with that. He sat with it for a long time. She wrote. He said, this should be uncomfortable. She said, yes. He said, it's not. She said, I know. He said, why isn't it? She said, because you came to the steps on Tuesday. The coming was the decision. The discomfort was possible then. Now you're already here. He said, already here. She said, yes. He said, and here is. She said, accurate, yes. He looked at the notebook. He said, the category without a title. She said, yes. He said, what happens to entries without a category? She said, they accumulate until the category becomes clear. He said, and then? She said, and then the title arrives, and I write it at the top, and the accumulated entries make sense in a way they didn't individually. He said, you're waiting for the title. She said, yes. He said, and when it arrives? She said, I'll write it. He said, the whole notebook. She said, the whole notebook, 25. He said, the Tuesday notebook. She said, the Tuesday notebook, yes. He stood. He said, the gloves. She said, yes. He said, the step is probably not. She said, I know. He said, I sat on it anyway. She said, yes. He said, that's also in the 25th notebook. She said, yes, that entry is in. He said, what does it say? She said, it says that you sat on the step anyway, and that the anyway is the most significant word in the entry. He said, why? She said, because anyway is what happens after the protocols and the framework and the contamination concern have all been noted, and the action happens regardless. He said, anyway is override. She said, anyway is choice, yes. He said, I chose. She said, yes. He said, with full information. She said, yes. He said, and the choice was. She said, the step, Tuesday, this. He looked at the notebook. He said, next Tuesday. She said, I'll be on the steps. He walked away. He walked back to the Hassaikai. He sat at his desk. He removed his gloves with the specific, careful process. He said nothing to anyone. He thought about the anyway for a long time. He thought about load-bearing elements. He thought about the thing the framework was preventing itself from achieving by the logic of its own premises. He thought about 25 notebooks and a category without a title. He thought about Tuesday. The Tuesdays became a pattern. 6 of them. On the 6th one he said, the Hassaikai. She said, yes. He said, the project, the quirk-destroying bullets. She said, Notebook 20, institutional architecture. He said, what does it say? She said, it says the project is designed to change the fundamental architecture of the quirk era. The bullets are the mechanism. The intended outcome is a world where quirks can be removed. He said, and. She said, and the project is built on the framework, the contamination framework extended to the world. The world's quirks are the contamination. The bullets are the protocol. He said, you see the connection. She said, I see the load-bearing element in the project. The project is what happens when the internal framework becomes external ambition. He said, that's accurate. She said, yes. He said, and the problem with it. She said, the same problem as the internal framework. It's trying to control the uncontrollable. Quirks are fundamental to the people who have them. You can't sanitize a person without destroying the person. He said, some would say that's acceptable. She said, you don't think it's acceptable. He said, what makes you think I don't? She said, you've been sitting on the steps for 6 Tuesdays. The steps are not clean. The encounter is not controlled. You're doing it anyway. He said, the anyway. She said, yes, the anyway says something about the absolute version of the framework. He said, what does it say? She said, it says the absolute version is wrong. The framework is useful in degrees. Absolute purity is impossible, and trying to achieve it costs what you've paid. He said, what have I paid? She said, the isolation is the cost. The controlled distance from everything that can't be put through the protocols. That's an enormous cost. He said, I don't experience it as a cost. She said, you came to the steps. He said, yes. She said, you wouldn't have come to the steps if you weren't already aware of the cost. He was quiet. She wrote. He said, the girl. She said, yes. He said, Iri. She said, yes. He said, Notebook 20. She said, yes, the Iri entries are the most difficult in the institutional architecture notebook. He said, why? She said, because she's a child, and the project requires her to be a component, and those two things are the most significant architectural contradiction in the Hassaikai. He said, contradiction. She said, you can't run an organization on the premise that people are more valuable than their quirks, and simultaneously use a child as a raw material. He said, I don't. She said, say the accurate version. He stopped. He said, the project requires her. She said, yes. He said, and she's. She said, a child, yes. He said, both things are true. She said, yes, both things simultaneously. He said, and the contradiction. She said, means one of them has to resolve, the project or the child. They can't both continue indefinitely. He said, the project. She said, I know what the project is supposed to do for the Yakuza. I know what it's supposed to do for your vision of the world. She said, and I know what it's doing to her. He said, you've never met her. She said, I've read the intelligence files. I've written Notebook 20. I know what it's doing. He said, and. She said, and it's the framework hurting a child by treating the uncontrollable as contamination to be corrected. He was very quiet. She put the pen down. She said, that's the entry I've been most careful about writing. He said, why careful? She said, because it's the one that requires me to say something difficult to someone I've been sitting on steps with for 6 Tuesdays. He said, say it. She said, the project is the most expensive version of the framework. It costs Iri what the framework has cost you, the ability to be who she is without it being treated as contamination. She said, you know that. He said, yes. She said, you've known it. He said, yes. She said, and you've been coming to the steps anyway. He said, yes. She said, the anyway again. He said, yes. She said, what does this anyway mean? He said, I don't know yet. She said, yes you do. He was quiet for a long time. He said, it means the framework's absolute version is wrong. She said, yes. He said, and the project is the absolute version externalized. She said, yes. He said, and if the internal absolute version is wrong. She said, the external one is also wrong. He said, yes. Long silence. She said, the category without a title. He said, yes. She said, I found the title this week. He looked at her. She opened notebook 25. She showed him. The title at the top of the page was, The Thing That Made the Anyway Possible. He read it. He said, the thing that made the anyway possible. She said, yes. He said, what is the thing? She said, the entries will tell you, there are 6 of them now. He said, 1 per Tuesday. She said, yes. He said, can I read them? She said, yes. She handed him the notebook. He held it with his gloved hands. He read. The entries were precise and honest and written at what he now recognized as 2 different speeds, the fast analytical speed and the slower processing speed that she used when something mattered more than it was convenient for it to matter. The slower speed was most of notebook 25. He read the first entry. She had written the pavement encounter. He stopped voluntarily and stood for 2 minutes before I acknowledged him. The voluntary stop is the data. The 2 minutes is the data. The quality of observation, analysis rather than assessment, is the data. The clean focus observed from 40 meters is the data. All of it is data that belongs in a category I don't have a title for yet. He read the second entry. She had written first Tuesday on the steps. He sat above rather than beside. The above position maintains distance while still being present. This is the framework in a form I recognize, not absence, managed proximity. He told me his Tuesday route. That was not managed. That was the anyway operating before the protocols could engage. He read the third entry. She had written the gloves and the step. He sat on the step with the gloves on. The gloves are the framework externalized, the minimum viable protocol that allows the thing to happen that the absolute version would prevent. He invented a protocol that made the Tuesday possible. That's significant, the framework making room for its own exception. He read the fourth. She had written, today he asked about categories. He wanted to know which notebook and which section. He's learning the system. The system is mine. He's choosing to learn it. That's the most accurate thing I can write about what this is becoming. He read the fifth. She had written, the eerie conversation is coming. I can feel it building in the 6 Tuesday entries. He knows the contradiction. He's been sitting with the contradiction. The Tuesdays are where he sits with contradictions that can't be resolved by the framework's standard approach. He read the 6th. She had written, today I found the title. The thing that made the anyway possible. The anyway is the action that happens after the framework has been fully noted, and the action occurs regardless. The thing that made it possible is that something arrived that the framework didn't have a protocol for, and the arriving was too significant to write a protocol for afterward. She had written, that's the whole entry. She had drawn a star. He looked at the star. He looked at the notebook. He said, the thing that made the anyway possible. She said, yes. He said, what's the thing? She said, the entry says. He said, say it directly. She said, you. She said it simply. Not as a performance, not as a declaration, as the accurate answer to a direct question. The accurate answer was, you. He held the notebook. He said, the entry says the thing that made the anyway possible is me. She said, you arrived before the protocol could be written. The focus on the pavement was the arriving. By the time the protocol could have engaged the anyway had already happened. He said, and after the anyway happened. She said, the category without a title started accumulating entries. He said, and now it has a title. She said, yes. He said, and the title is the thing that made the anyway possible. She said, yes. He said, which is me. She said, yes. He said, and the notebook is 25. She said, yes. He said, and you've been writing it for 6 Tuesdays. She said, yes. He said, and the eerie entry is in Notebook 20. She said, yes. He said, and Notebook 20 says the contradiction requires resolution. She said, yes. He said, and you're not telling me how to resolve it. She said, no, the resolution is yours. He said, because telling me would make it your resolution. She said, yes. He said, and it has to be mine. She said, with full information, yes. He said, full information being. She said, the framework and its cost, and the contradiction, and the anyway and Notebook 25. He said, all of it. She said, all of it simultaneously. He said, the both things. She said, yes. He said, you use that phrase. She said, it's the most accurate framework for most real things. Two true things at the same time, rather than requiring one to cancel the other. He said, the Hassaikai is real. She said, yes. He said, and the contradiction is real. She said, yes. He said, and the 6 Tuesdays are real. She said, yes. He said, and the entry in Notebook 25 is real. She said, yes. He said, all simultaneously. She said, all simultaneously. He looked at his gloved hands. He looked at the notebook. He handed it back. He said, the contradiction requires resolution. She said, yes. He said, the resolution is mine. She said, yes. He said, and whatever the resolution is. She said, it will be documented in Notebook 20. He said, and the Tuesdays. She said, the Tuesdays are in 25. He said, separately. She said, they're the thing that made the anyway possible. Yes, separately. He stood. He said, next Tuesday. She said, I'll be on the steps. He walked away. He walked back to the Hassaikai compound. He sat at his desk. He removed his gloves. He looked at his hands. He thought for a very long time. He thought about load-bearing elements, and the thing the framework was preventing itself from achieving, and the anyway, and the 6 Tuesdays, and a child, and a contradiction that required resolution. He thought about the accurate answer to a direct question. He thought about you. He sat with all of it. He sat for a long time. He had made more controlled decisions than anyone he knew. He had never made a decision that mattered the way this one was going to matter. He looked at his hands. He thought the contamination framework encounters an input it has no protocol for. He thought the input arrived before the protocol could be written. He thought the anyway happened. He looked at his desk. He began writing. Not in a notebook. In the specific formal language of someone who was dismantling something they had built. He wrote for 3 hours. What he wrote was the document that ended the quirk-destroying bullet project. Not an external ending, an internal one. The specific architectural decision of the person who had built the thing, determining that the load-bearing premise of the thing was wrong, and that wrong foundations produced wrong buildings, regardless of how carefully constructed. He stopped the project. He documented it in the language of the organization. He made it formal. He made it clean. Then he wrote a second document. The second document was about Iri. He spent longer on the second document. When he finished the second document, he sat for another hour. Then he made a phone call. The person he called was not Yakuza. The person he called was someone who had access to channels that led to people who could ensure that a child was extracted from a situation she should never have been in. He made the arrangements. It took most of the night. When it was done, he sat in the quiet of the compound and felt the specific quality of a load-bearing element having been removed. The building it had supported was going to require significant reconstruction. He understood that. He began the reconstruction immediately. Tuesday. She was on the steps. He sat above her. She said, "You made a decision." He said, "Yes." She said, "The project." He said, "Yes." She said, "And Iri." He said, "She's been extracted. Safe, I made the arrangements." She said, "You made the arrangements yourself." He said, "The decision was mine. The arrangements should be too." She wrote. He said, notebook 20. She said, yes. He said, what section? She said, I'll need a new one. He said, what title? She said, the resolution. He said, the resolution. She said, yes. He said, what does the entry say? She said, I'm writing it now. He waited. She wrote. She said, it says the contradiction resolved in the direction that cost the most institutionally and cost the least in everything else. She said, and that the resolution was his. He said, with full information. She said, yes. He said, both things. She said, the Hassaikai cost and the child safe and the project ended and the framework beginning its reconstruction. She said, all simultaneously. He said, the reconstruction. She said, yes. He said, the framework's absolute version was wrong. She said, yes. He said, the reconstruction is the corrected version. She said, yes. He said, what does the corrected version look like? She said, I don't have the full picture yet, that's what the Tuesdays are for. He said, the Tuesdays are for the corrected framework. She said, the Tuesdays are in notebook 25. He said, yes. She said, they're the thing that made the anyway possible. He said, yes. He said, and the anyway is still happening. She said, yes. She said, you're on the steps. He said, yes. She said, that's the anyway. He said, yes. He said, still. She said, still. He looked at his gloved hands. He looked at the steps. He said, the steps are probably not. She said, I know. He said, and I'm. She said, and you're here anyway. He said, yes. She said, the anyway is the title of the Tuesday entries. He said, all of them. She said, all of them, the whole notebook. He said, how many stars? She said, I've been counting since the pavement encounter. He said, how many? She said, 7, 1 per Tuesday and 1 for the resolution. He said, 1 for the resolution. She said, yes, the resolution gets its own star. He said, what does the star mean? She said that it matters, that it's in the permanent record, that I don't cross it out. He said, you don't cross it out. She said, no. He said, even with. She said, the framework and the Hassaikai and the reconstruction and all of it. No, I don't cross it out. He said, why not? She said, because the anyway is real, and real things don't get crossed out. He said, the anyway is real. She said, yes. He said, and what the anyway is in response to. She said, is also real. He said, yes. He said, the thing that made it possible. She said, yes. He said, still. She said, still. He looked at the steps. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. She was writing. Both speeds simultaneously. The analysis and the processing. The documented and the real. He sat on the step. He said, the Hassaikai is going to require significant reconstruction. She said, yes. He said, I'm going to do it. She said, yes. He said, with full information. She said, yes. He said, both things simultaneously. She said, always both things. He said, the cost is real. She said, yes. He said, and the anyway is real. She said, yes. He said, and I'm here. She said, yes. She said, you are. She said, on the steps. He said, yes. She said, that's everything. He said, yes. She said, that's always been everything. The Tuesday was ordinary around the specific extraordinary quality of someone sitting on steps that were probably not clean, making a choice that was going to cost everything it was going to cost and doing it anyway. The anyway. Still, she wrote the last entry in notebook 25. She wrote 7th Tuesday. He told me about the resolution. He made the arrangements himself. He said the decision was his and the arrangements should be too. He sat on the steps. She wrote, that's the entry. She wrote the steps and the anyway and the both things and the reconstruction beginning. She wrote all of it simultaneously. She drew 7 stars. She looked at 7. She drew one more. 8. She wrote 8 because the 7th Tuesday and the resolution and the step that is probably not clean and the anyway that is still happening and the thing that made it possible and the real that doesn't get crossed out. She looked at 8 stars. She said yes. She said that's right. She closed notebook 25. She opened notebook 26. She wrote at the top the reconstruction. She wrote under it from the corrected foundation. She wrote under that both things, always. She looked at the 3 lines. She kept them. She looked at him on the step above her. He looked at her. She said next Tuesday. He said I'll be on the steps. She said yes. She said you will. The Tuesday continued. The notebooks filled. The reconstruction began. And that is the complete story of Hassaikai, who built a framework for a world that contaminated everything it touched and sat on steps that were probably not clean for 8 Tuesdays anyway. Who read a notebook with no category title and found the title was the thing that made the anyway possible. Who resolved the contradiction in the direction that cost the most institutionally and cost the least in everything that the 8th Tuesday's 8 stars were actually about. Who is reconstructing something from a corrected foundation. Who showed up on the steps every Tuesday. Anyway, no cap, this is the most precise and honest story fiction Flux has told. And 26 notebooks are going to prove it. Every single one. If you made it to the very end of this story, you are absolutely Fiction Flux family, and we see you completely. Please subscribe and hit that like button and share this video with every anime fan you know, because every share helps us reach more people who love stories like this one. Drop in the comments what story you want next because we make these for you. See you in the next one.